The night air over Israel carried the sound of restless voices. For generations, the tribes of Jacob had lived under the guidance of judges and prophets, trusting God to raise leaders when danger came. Yet the people were weary of waiting. Surrounded by powerful nations with standing armies and glittering thrones, they felt exposed and leaderless. Philistine raids pressed hard against their borders. Ammonite warriors threatened from the east. Fear spread like a dry wind through the hills of Ephraim and the valleys of Benjamin. In Ramah, the prophet Samuel stood before the elders of Israel as they made their demand plain. "Appoint for us a king to govern us," they said, "like all the nations." Their words struck Samuel like a blow. He had served as judge since his youth, guiding the people with justice and prayer, but now they wanted something more tangible than the unseen hand of God. Samuel warned them of what a king would bring: taxes, conscription, fields taken for royal service, sons and daughters drawn into the machinery of power. Yet the elders would not yield. "No," they insisted, "we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." Samuel prayed through the night, and the Lord answered with both sorrow and permission. "Listen to the voice of the people," God said, "for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." It was a moment of quiet tragedy, the covenant people turning from divine rule to embrace human monarchy, choosing visible strength over invisible faith. Not long after, a young man named Saul entered the story. He came from the tribe of Benjamin, a clan nearly extinguished in past wars. Tall, broad-shouldered, and striking in appearance, Saul looked every bit the leader the people desired. Yet his first appearance was humble and almost comedic. Sent by his father to find a band of lost donkeys, Saul wandered the countryside in frustration. When he finally crossed paths with Samuel, it seemed an accident, but it was the quiet unfolding of God's plan. The prophet anointed him with oil in secret, declaring that the Lord had chosen him to shepherd his people. At first, Saul seemed almost reluctant to accept the crown. When Samuel later presented him to the assembled tribes, the new king hid among the baggage, as if to escape the weight of destiny. But when he stood before the crowd, towering over all others, a murmur of approval swept through Israel. Here was the king they had asked for, strong, handsome, a warrior in the making. The people shouted, "Long live the king!" Hope rose like the dawn over a nation desperate for security. Yet even in this moment of celebration, the seeds of conflict lay buried in the soil of their choice. They had a king, but in turning from the rule of God to the rule of man, they had set in motion a story that would test the very heart of Israel. The early days of Saul's reign unfolded with the kind of triumph that made the people believe they had chosen well. Not long after his anointing, the Ammonites threatened the town of Jabesh-Gilead, surrounding it and demanding brutal terms of surrender. News of the siege spread quickly, reaching Saul's ears as he returned from tending his father's fields. The Spirit of God rushed upon him with sudden force. Seizing a pair of oxen, he cut them into pieces and sent the fragments throughout Israel with a message: "Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." Fear of the Lord gripped the tribes, and an army of thousands assembled overnight. Saul led the charge with decisive strength. At dawn, he divided his forces and struck the Ammonite camp from 3 sides, scattering them before the heat of day. The victory was swift and overwhelming, and the people rejoiced. Those who had doubted Saul's calling now clamored for the execution of anyone who had questioned his kingship. But Saul surprised them with mercy, declaring, "No one shall be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." In that moment, he stood tall not only as a warrior, but as a leader who remembered the hand of God in his success. Samuel seized the occasion to gather the nation at Gilgal. There, under open sky and the smoke of sacrifices, the people renewed their covenant and confirmed Saul as king. Joy and unity filled the camp. Israel at last had a monarch who could rally armies and inspire courage. For a brief time, it seemed as though the people's gamble had been rewarded. Yet beneath the celebration, a quiet tension stirred. The call for a king had been born of fear, fear of enemies, fear of uncertainty, fear that God's invisible rule was not enough. Though Saul began with humility and a measure of faith, The expectations placed upon him were immense. A nation that longed for safety and power would demand more than victory. It would demand unwavering strength, swift decisions, and signs of control. Saul's heart, already prone to caution and doubt, would soon face tests that no battlefield could prepare him for. The next challenge would reveal not the strength of his arm, but the depth of his obedience. The test came at Gilgal, on a day heavy with tension. The Philistines had gathered an overwhelming force, thousands of chariots, horsemen, and soldiers, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Their iron weapons glinted in the sun, a reminder that Israel, still a nation of farmers and shepherds, had little defense against such power. Fear rippled through the Israelite ranks. Soldiers hid in caves and behind rocks, some slipping across the Jordan to escape. Those who remained trembled, their eyes fixed on Saul for direction. Samuel had instructed Saul to wait 7 days for him to arrive and offer the sacrifices before battle. But as the days passed and Samuel did not appear, the army began to scatter. Saul watched his men melt away, his authority thinning with every heartbeat. Anxiety rose like a flood within him. He knew the command. Only the prophet could make the burnt offering. Yet the pressure of the moment weighed heavier than obedience. Convinced that action was better than silence, Saul called for the altar and offered the sacrifice himself. The smoke was still rising when Samuel arrived. His face darkened as he saw what had been done. "What have you done?" the prophet demanded. Saul tried to explain. His troops were deserting, the Philistines were massing, and Samuel had not come at the appointed time. He feared the enemy might attack before God's favor could be secured. But Samuel's reply cut through every excuse. "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart to rule his people." The words fell like a hammer. This was not a mere rebuke, it was a verdict. Saul had allowed fear to override faith, and in doing so he fractured the foundation of his reign. Though he remained king in name, the blessing that had once set him apart began to lift. The decision to seize control, small in appearance, understandable in human terms, marked the beginning of a deeper unraveling. Even so, Saul pressed on, determined to secure Israel's future. Victory and defeat would follow, but the certainty of God's favor had been shaken. In the quiet spaces of his heart, insecurity took root, setting the stage for choices that would lead him further from the one who had chosen him. The fracture widened in the campaign against the Amalekites. Samuel delivered God's clear command: destroy everything that belonged to this enemy nation, men, women, children, livestock, leaving no remnant, as a sign of total devotion and obedience. The Amalekites were a long-standing foe, known for their brutal attacks on Israel's ancestors during the Exodus. This was not simply war. It was an act of divine justice meant to remove a persistent threat and demonstrate that victory belonged to the Lord alone. Saul gathered his troops and struck the Amalekites with decisive force. Their cities burned, their armies scattered. Yet when the dust settled, Saul made a fateful choice. He spared Agag, the Amalekite king, and kept the best of the sheep and cattle, claiming they were to be offered as sacrifices to God. To his soldiers, and even to himself, it may have seemed a noble compromise. Why destroy what could be used in worship? But the command had been explicit, and Saul's reasoning masked a deeper truth. He feared the judgment of men more than the command of God. When Samuel arrived, the sound of bleating sheep betrayed Saul's disobedience. "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears?" the prophet asked. Saul defended himself, insisting the people had spared the best animals for sacrifice, but Samuel would not be deceived. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. With those words, the prophet pronounced the sentence Saul dreaded most. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Though Saul pleaded for forgiveness, the decision was final. The monarchy would remain in his house for a time, but the anointing had already begun to shift toward another. Samuel turned to leave, but Saul grabbed the hem of his robe, tearing it. The prophet paused and delivered a grim sign. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, one better than you." The rip of fabric echoed the rift between Saul and the God who had once called him. From that day, the relationship between king and prophet was never the same. Saul still sat on the throne, but the certainty of divine favor was gone. His victories would grow hollow, his decisions more desperate. And in the quiet of God's rejection, a new figure was already rising, one whose heart, not height, would shape Israel's future. Saul's story warns that leadership without humility breeds insecurity, and insecurity, unguarded, breeds destruction. What began as an answer to Israel's fears became a cautionary tale of fear's ultimate cost. What small compromises or unchecked jealousies today might echo Saul's downfall if left unchallenged? If this story of King Saul's rise and fall spoke to you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter in this series. Like this video to help others discover these powerful lessons, and share it with a friend who might need this reminder about faith and obedience. I'd love to hear from you as well. What moment in Saul's journey stands out most to you so far? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, and your insight could spark a great conversation for the next episode.